It started with a small, unmarked package, barely the size of a book, quietly sliding through the side gates of Windsor Castle. No return address, no courier record, nothing. But the moment a royal guard picked it up, he felt something wasn't right. The box was too light, almost empty, and yet sealed inside was a message so personal, so unexpected, that senior officials were called in within minutes. The palace has dealt with threats, hoaxes, and mysteries before, but never anything like this. Who would dare send this? And why now? Before we dive into this unbelievable royal guard story, take a moment to tap that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you love emotional, behind-the-scenes royal family stories, consider subscribing. No pressure at all. Share this video with someone who enjoys a good royal mystery. The morning had begun like any other at Windsor. Soft winter light pushed through the pale clouds, the kind that makes a castle look almost unreal. Too still, too perfect, like it's frozen in a photograph. Royal guards stood at their posts, steady and silent, their breaths forming faint white mist in the cold air. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious. Just another day of routine security checks, passing vehicles, and a calm rhythm of royal life. But just after 7:12 a.m., something shifted. Guard Sergeant Daniel Hall, known for his sharp instincts and almost uncomfortable ability to sense trouble before anyone else, noticed a small figure near the auxiliary gate on the east side. The gate wasn't used by tourists or public visitors. Only authorized staff, scheduled deliveries, and vetted contractors ever came through it. Yet there was someone standing there, just far enough away to blend with the shadows, just close enough to make Daniel narrow his eyes. The figure didn't speak, didn't wave, didn't even try to approach the guard. It simply placed a small package on the ground, light brown, no labels, no branding, and walked away with an oddly quick, almost jittery pace. Daniel stepped forward, calling out with the formal authority his job demanded. "Sir, you cannot leave items at this gate. Please stop and identify." But by the time he'd spoken, the figure had already turned the corner, blending into the early morning fog. Gone. He frowned. Most people stop when a royal guard calls out. Even confused tourists usually freeze like statues. But this person? They almost seemed prepared to run. Daniel's hand hovered at his radio. Technically, a small package was an emergency. Things were misplaced or dropped near the ground occasionally, and 99% of the time, the items turned out to be nothing more than forgotten bags, lost phones, or deliveries left in the wrong spot by a sleepy driver. But something about the box bothered him. It was too clean, too intentional, and the figure's hurried exit. That was no accident. He approached slowly, remembering protocol. Royal guards are trained to read small details, to catch what most eyes would skim over. As he crouched, he noticed the box had no visible tape, just a perfectly folded seam, almost like someone took great care to wrap it neatly, but not professionally. No postal stickers, no handwritten notes, not even a faint mark from a pen. A box with no story. "Control, this is Hall at Eastgate," he said into his radio. "I've got an unverified parcel left by an unidentified male, requesting secondary inspection team." The radio crackled back within seconds. "Copy that, Hall. Stand by." Daniel didn't look away from the package. His instincts were rarely wrong, and right now, they were practically screaming. The box was small, barely the size of a thin hardcover book. It weighed almost nothing when he gently lifted it, which only increased his unease. Empty? Or deliberately light? Within minutes, 2 additional guards arrived along with 1 security officer from the palace operations team. They examined it visually, checking for wires, punctures, anything unusual. Nothing obvious. "Let's move it to the secure inspection locker," the officer said calmly, though her eyes told a different story. She'd seen too many strange attempts to breach palace boundaries, most of them harmless, but a few that left a mark on her memory. Daniel carried the package himself. He didn't know why, but he felt responsible for it now. Something about the moment the figure dropped it, the way the fog swallowed him, it felt like the beginning of something larger. Inside the small, secure room built for pre-inspection, the package was placed on a reinforced metal table. A scanning technician arrived shortly after, wheeling in portable equipment used for rapid assessment. While the machine hummed to life, Daniel stood at the side of the room, arms behind his back, watching every movement closely. "Let's see what you are," the technician murmured as the scanner glided over the box. The screen lit up. No electronic components. No dense materials. No metallic traces. No powders or unusual chemicals. Instead, just one object inside. A single sheet of paper. Daniel exchanged a glance with the officer beside him. Paper meant communication. Communication meant intention. And intention meant this wasn't random at all. The officer exhaled slowly. "Open it." The technician put on gloves and carefully unfolded the seam, revealing a perfectly white envelope inside. Thick, high-quality paper. The kind used for formal letters or confidential correspondence. No writing on the outside. No initials. No seal. Daniel's pulse quickened, not from fear but from something harder to find. Anticipation. The kind you feel right before turning the page of a story that suddenly gets interesting. The officer lifted the envelope and weighed it lightly in her hand. "Feels like one page. And that's supposed to make me feel better?" Daniel muttered under his breath. She offered a tired half-smile. "Let's hope it's good news for once." She slid a finger under the flap and opened the envelope slowly, carefully. When she pulled out the sheet of paper, Daniel noticed her expression change almost instantly. Her eyebrows lifted, first in surprise, then in confusion, and finally in something that looked suspiciously like disbelief. "What is it?" Daniel asked. She looked at him, almost hesitant. It's addressed to a member of the royal family." Daniel blinked. "Which one?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she read the first line again, her mouth tightening into a thin line. Whatever she saw on that paper, whatever had been written so deliberately, so confidently, it wasn't simple, and it definitely wasn't casual. "Officer," Daniel pressed gently. "Who is it for?" She lowered the page slightly, her voice lower than before. "It's meant for Prince William." Silence filled the room. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a physical force. A package left by a stranger. A message hidden inside. No sender identity. No warning. No request. Just a letter addressed to the future king. And for the first time that morning, he understood exactly why his instincts had flared the moment he saw that small brown box near the gate. This wasn't random. Someone wanted the message to reach William. Personally, quietly, and without the eyes of the outside world knowing. But who? And why choose a royal guard instead of official channels? As Daniel stared at the blank package, the fog outside continued to drift around the castle walls, soft and quiet, as if the world had no idea that something unusual had just slipped into the heart of Windsor. The day was no longer ordinary. The palace was no longer calm. And this small, silent envelope was about to stir emotions, questions, and memories no one inside the royal circle ever expected. The letter didn't travel through the usual palace corridors. It didn't pass through public relations staff, senior advisors, or the communications office. Instead, it stayed within a small circle, 3 guards, 1 security officer, and a single sealed evidence folder. All of them understood immediately that the fewer eyes involved, the safer the situation would be. Anything addressed privately to Prince William carried a weight beyond procedure. It carried emotional gravity. The envelope, carefully resealed and placed inside a protective sleeve, was transported through a side passage normally used for internal logistics. Daniel walked alongside the officer, his boots tapping against the polished floor in an unnervingly quiet rhythm. He couldn't help but feel the energy in the air change as they moved deeper into the castle. Even the staff they passed seemed to sense that something unusual was unfolding. Word travels fast inside royal walls, but this time not a whisper slipped out. When they reached the discreet security briefing room tucked behind the main administrative wing, 2 senior officials were already waiting. One of them, Richard McAllister, the head of palace security, straightened the moment they entered. "Is this the item from the East Gate?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the officer replied. Addressed directly to Prince William. No sender identity. Richard's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Did the scan pick up anything unusual? Only a single sheet of paper. He nodded, then turned to Daniel. You were the first point of contact. Yes, sir. I witnessed someone placing it by the gate. Male, medium build, early to mid-50s probably, didn't speak. Left immediately when I called out. Suspicious? Absolutely. Richard folded his arms, thinking. He was the kind of man who didn't panic easily, but Daniel knew the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone preparing to deal with something delicate, something that could turn into a headline if mishandled. Let's see the contents, Richard said finally. The officer handed him the envelope. He opened it slowly, reading carefully, his face shifting almost imperceptibly through a series of emotions. Curiosity, surprise, something close to empathy, then something deeper, heavier, as if a memory had been quietly awakened. After a long moment, he exhaled and placed the letter down on the table. This isn't a threat, he said quietly. It's personal, very personal. Daniel exchanged a glance with the officer. Personal letters didn't arrive in unmarked boxes left in the fog. Personal messages didn't come from strange figures avoiding identification. Something wasn't adding up. Permission to ask what it says, sir? Daniel said carefully. Richard looked at him for a moment, then nodded. You found the package. You should understand what this is. He slid the letter across the table. Daniel's eyes scanned the opening lines first. Simple handwriting, slightly shaky, like someone who hadn't picked up a pen in years. No fancy calligraphy, no royal formality, just raw, human emotion in every curve of the ink. Your Royal Highness, I'm writing to you because I have no other way left. I owe your mother something I never repaid. And before I go, I need you to know the truth. Daniel's breath caught slightly. Princess Diana. That single name carried more emotional weight inside the palace than any political story or security briefing ever could. Even now, decades later, she remained a silent presence. Felt remembered, honored. He continued reading. I was a paramedic the night of the crash. I held her hand. She spoke her last words, and for years I've carried them alone. I don't seek attention. I don't want the world to know. I only want her son to hear them. Daniel's hands froze. His heartbeat, which had been steady through countless emergencies, seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the small room. The officer beside him covered her mouth slightly, inhaling sharply. Even Richard, who had weathered every type of crisis, looked shaken. The letter continued. They told us to remain silent back then. They told us the world was too unstable, too emotional, too ready to explode if more details surfaced. I agreed. Maybe I shouldn't have. I don't know anymore. All I know is that she wasn't alone in those final minutes. I need her son to know that. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not protocol-driven pressure. Something human. For a moment, the room was utterly silent. Not even the distant footsteps in the corridor could be heard. The air felt heavy, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. Richard finally broke the silence. This cannot be ignored, but it also cannot become public. The officer nodded. We need to verify whether this paramedic is real. Yes, quietly, Richard added. No chatter, no external agencies, no leaks, not one word beyond this room. Daniel looked at the letter again. Whoever wrote, it wasn't seeking fame or drama. The handwriting alone revealed a kind of vulnerability, the kind that comes from carrying a burden for too long. Sir, Daniel said softly, this man, if he's telling the truth, why come forward now? After all these years. Richard didn't answer immediately. He tapped a finger lightly on the paper, thoughtful. People nearing the end of their lives often try to make peace with themselves. He said finally, regrets grow heavier. Silence becomes impossible. And guilt, he paused. Guilt waits for no one. The officer leaned forward. Should we deliver the letter directly to Prince William? Yes, Richard replied without hesitation. But we need to confirm everything first. If this is genuine, he deserves to hear those words, yes, but not without context, protection, and clarity. Daniel felt the responsibility settle on him more deeply. He had picked up the package. He had initiated the process that led to this moment. Now, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, He felt connected to the story unfolding, like fate had tapped him on the shoulder without warning. "Sir," he asked, "do we know the sender's name?" Richard nodded. "It's signed. At the bottom." He handed Daniel the envelope again. Daniel looked. A single name, a simple signature. Not a public figure, not a journalist, not anyone remotely known to royal staff. Just an ordinary man. A man who had carried something extraordinary and unbearably heavy for decades. Daniel exhaled slowly. So the message, it really was meant for him. For William alone. "Yes," Richard said quietly. "And if what this man says is true, Prince William is about to hear something he has waited his whole life to understand." Daniel felt a shiver run through him. The castle, so still and calm outside, suddenly felt like the center of a storm. One made not of scandal, but of emotion. A message long buried. A truth long withheld. A son finally on the edge of learning something deeply personal about the mother he lost too soon. And it all began with a quiet package left in the fog. The letter stayed locked away in a secure file, but its emotional charge lingered in the atmosphere of the palace like invisible electricity. Those who had read it spoke little, and those who hadn't sensed something was shifting behind closed doors. But for Daniel, the weight of the message felt personal in a way he couldn't easily explain. He wasn't family, he wasn't an advisor, but he had become a link in a chain he never expected to touch. By early afternoon, the discreet investigation began. Not loud, not public, not even through official channels. Only 3 people, Richard, the officer who first opened the envelope, and Daniel, were assigned to verify the identity of the man who claimed to be a paramedic the night of the fatal crash in Paris. Richard began by placing the letter gently on the meeting table. "His name is on the bottom," he said, "but we can't assume he's real. We start from scratch, records, archives, anything we can get without alerting outside agencies." The name was handwritten simply. Thomas Alder. Not famous, not political. A name so ordinary it could almost disappear. "What if he's lying?" the officer asked. "What if he isn't?" Richard countered. "Either way, we need to find him." Daniel studied the signature again. Something about it felt honest. No dramatic loops, no exaggerated strokes. Just quiet, controlled handwriting. A man trying to speak after decades of silence. They started with basic internal checks. The palace kept corroborative lists from international emergency units from that night, cross-referenced after the crash for security reasons. Daniel scanned down the Paris emergency personnel list from 1997, running his fingers slowly across each name. There, he stopped. "Sir," he murmured, tapping the page lightly. "He's on the roster. Alder, Thomas J. Ambulance Unit 14. Paris Emergency Medical Service." The officer leaned in, her expression shifting from uncertainty to cautious belief. So he was there. Richard didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed a fraction. At least he exists. More than that, Daniel added softly, he was part of the response team. But verify his service didn't confirm his story. Not yet. They needed more. Richard motioned for Daniel to follow him into the smaller annex office. Inside, he opened a drawer containing old cross-border security archives. "This file hasn't been opened in years," he said. "Paris forwarded it back when everything was being sifted through, before the public inquiries, before the media storm." He handed Daniel a thin folder. Inside were notes from the early days following the crash, lists of medical responders, written statements, timelines of arrival, and among them, a small entry. Responder reported brief verbal communication from female passenger, not included in main transcript due to lack of full clarity. There was no name attached, just a coded reference. But something about the phrasing felt eerily connected to the letter. The officer joined them, reading over Daniel's shoulder. If that was him, he must have wanted to speak up back then. "Maybe he tried," Richard said, but the world wasn't ready to hear anything new. Daniel swallowed. "Do we know where he is now?" Richard nodded. "I've already started the trace. He left emergency service years ago. Health issues, early retirement. Moved out of the city. Lives alone now. Not far from London, actually." "Near London?" the officer repeated. After all those years in France? He moved shortly after his retirement. Richard paused, lowering his voice. Last recorded address places him in Reading. Quiet neighborhood. No known family. Daniel felt a sinking ache in his chest. This wasn't the profile of a man chasing recognition. This was a man approaching the end of his life, trying to clear a debt to a memory that had lived in the back of his mind for decades. What's our next step? Daniel asked. We track him down, Richard replied. Discreetly, no uniforms, no official cars. No one outside this circle can know. If this man is dying or believes he's dying, then whatever he wrote may be the last truth he has to offer. Should I go with you, sir? Daniel asked. Richard paused, evaluating him the way a commander evaluates a soldier's readiness. You're the one who found the package, he said finally. You sensed something was different. You'll come. Daniel nodded, a mix of tension and responsibility tightening in his chest. He wasn't trained for high-level investigations or emotional revelations, but he was trained to be present, steady, attentive. And sometimes that was what mattered most. They left the palace through a quiet exit used for internal transport, traveling in an unmarked black vehicle. No escort, no warning lights. Just the three of them in a strange, fragile mission unfolding in silence. As they neared Reading, the sky grew heavier, clouds thickening like they were sheltering the neighborhood from the outside world. The streets were quiet, small houses with tidy hedges, worn fences, and afternoon stillness. This is it, Richard said, pointing to a modest brick home with peeling paint on the window frames. Daniel felt his heart thump once hard. They walked up to the door. No doorbell, just a weathered knocker. Richard lifted it gently and tapped twice. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then faint footsteps. Slow, tired. The door opened a few centimeters. An older man came into view, thin, pale, eyes a mix of exhaustion and deep, haunting memory. His gray hair was untidy, his breathing faintly strained. But his gaze was the kind that had seen too much and carried too much. Mr. Alder? Richard said softly. The man nodded. We're here about the letter you left at Windsor Castle. Richard explained calmly. Thomas Alder closed his eyes for a moment, not in fear, not in surprise, in relief. I wondered, he whispered, voice trembling slightly, how long it would take for someone to find me. Richard glanced at Daniel and the officer, then back at Thomas. May we come in? Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside. The small living room was simple, worn furniture, framed photographs, shelves filled with medical books, and one corner covered with old newspaper clippings about the crash, neatly collected but never displayed. Not obsessive, just painful. Thomas eased into an armchair. His hand shook slightly, whether from age or emotion. Daniel couldn't tell. I didn't know if the letter would reach him, Thomas said quietly. I didn't want to send it through official channels. Too many filters. Too many people who'd bury it again. Daniel sat across from him. Why now? Thomas looked at him with soft, tired eyes. Because my time is running out, and a son deserves to know his mother's last words. A silence filled the room that felt sacred, heavy, human. And because, Thomas continued, voice cracking, she wasn't alone. Not for a single moment. I need him to know that. Daniel felt something stir deep inside him. A mix of respect, sorrow, and the kind of empathy that hits unexpectedly hard. Tell us everything, Richard said gently. Thomas nodded. And then he began. Thomas Alder didn't launch into his story dramatically, nor did he rush through it. Instead, he took a long, unsteady breath, as though preparing to open a part of his memory he had kept locked for decades. The living room felt almost suspended in time. Quiet, still, holding on to every word he was about to say. I remember the night clearly, he began softly. The streets were chaotic, but we didn't know who was in the car at first. We just knew it was bad. His voice, though thin, carried a weight that pulled all three listeners deeper into the moment. There was smoke, screaming, cameras everywhere. It was impossible to see properly. I remember thinking, whoever was in that car didn't deserve to be dying like that. Daniel watched him closely. He wasn't just recounting a story. He was reliving a moment he had tried to bury, but never truly escaped. When we reached the vehicle, Thomas continued, I climbed into the back. She was conscious. Barely. But she was there, aware enough to speak. He paused to steady himself, pressing a hand to his chest. The officer offered him water, but he gently shook his head. No, I need to say this without stopping. Richard leaned forward, voice low. Take your time. Thomas nodded slowly. She was frightened, he whispered. Not for herself, but for her boys. Those words hit the room with the force of something holy. Daniel felt the sting of emotion rise behind his eyes. Even after all these years, the echo of Princess Diana's love for her sons was still powerful enough to shake a room of strangers. She asked, Are my boys safe? Thomas said, voice cracking. She said it twice, once clearly, once barely a whisper. He swallowed hard. I told her yes. I told her they were safe. I didn't know, but I needed her to believe it. The officer looked away for a moment, blinking back tears. Richard's expression tightened, not in coldness, but in the way a man shields himself from an emotional blow. Her last words, Thomas continued, were not about fear, not about regret, not about the crash. They were about love, the kind of love only a mother understands. He paused, breathing carefully. She said, Please tell them I love them. Tell them I'm with them. Silence flooded the room, not the empty kind, the heavy, emotional kind that presses on the heart. And then, Thomas whispered, she faded. We did everything, absolutely everything. But the moment she closed her eyes, I knew. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The room was thick with emotion, raw, unfiltered, sincere. This wasn't a story polished for the press or sensationalized for headlines. This was the truth from a man who had carried it inside him for far too long. Daniel steadied his breathing. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a moment as profoundly human as this. Why hide this for so long? The officer asked gently. Thomas looked at her with tired, sorrowful eyes. Because we were told not to speak. Because the world was grieving, and officials didn't want any more pieces of uncertainty thrown into the fire. And because he hesitated, because I was terrified that if I spoke, people would twist it, exploit it. Daniel understood. The world in 1997 was consumed by shock, confusion, accusation. A paramedic's testimony would become fuel for endless theories. But as I got older, Thomas said, the guilt grew heavier. I kept thinking, what if the boys assumed she died alone? What if they spent their whole lives believing there was no comfort in her final moments? He looked down, voice trembling. I couldn't let my life end with that on my conscience. Richard leaned back, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard from him. Mr. Alder, this is something only the family can decide how to receive. But I promise you, they will appreciate your honesty. Thomas closed his eyes, visibly relieved. Will Prince William know? He asked quietly. Yes, Richard said. He will, the officer added softly, and he will understand you came forward out of kindness, not agenda. For the first time since they arrived, Thomas smiled, small, fragile, but real. I'm glad, he said. I hope someone would see it that way. They stayed with him for a while longer, asking a few final questions, not probing, not interrogating, but clarifying details to ensure accuracy. Everything Thomas said aligned with the medical logs and fragments of testimony from the night. He had carried nothing but compassion all these years. When they finally stood to leave, Thomas reached for Daniel's hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. You were the one who found the package, he said. Thank you for not ignoring it. Thank you for letting this truth breathe. Daniel nodded, moved more deeply than he could admit. You did the right thing, sir. As they stepped out of the house, the clouds parted slightly, letting a muted light fall across the quiet street. It felt symbolic, gentle, respectful, almost like a blessing. Back at the palace, the mood was different. Not heavy, not chaotic, just waiting. Richard arranged a private meeting with Prince William. No formalities, no entourage, just a quiet space, a sealed envelope, and a son who deserved to know his mother's final message. Daniel wasn't present in the room. Protocol wouldn't allow it, but he stood nearby, close enough to sense the atmosphere shift when William entered. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Then the door opened. Prince William emerged with the letter in hand, eyes red but composed. Not broken, never broken, but deeply moved. He nodded to Richard first, then to the officer, then finally to Daniel. A silent acknowledgement, a thank you delivered without words. No cameras recorded it. No journalists twisted it. No crowds witnessed it. It was a private moment, pure, sacred, and untouched by the world outside. Later, William placed a letter inside a small locked box among his most personal keepsakes. Not for public release, not for history books, for his heart, and for Harry, whom he later called quietly, privately. For both of them, the truth was a balm they never expected. That night, within the walls of the palace, something rare happened. A memory long hidden was finally laid to rest. A mother's love reached her sons across decades, and a stranger's burden finally became peace. Outside, London carried on, busy, loud, unaware. But inside the palace, a quiet miracle had taken place. All because a guard sensed something unusual in the morning fog and chose to follow his instincts